Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Roksana Filipowska, and I am the Wordle Study Center Programs and Outreach Manager at the Yale University Art Gallery. As we begin this program, I'd like to invite you just to situate yourself with the webinar format. So you'll notice that there are two rectangles on the right of your screen. You may wish to move them around depending on what we're looking at so that you can really see the image. We will be looking at images together, so you may wish to brighten up the resolution on your screen. And Fred and I will be speaking for about 35 minutes. We'd like to leave a lot of time for questions and answers. So there is a Q&A feature that you are very welcome to put in and submit your questions throughout this program, and we will get to the Q&A towards the end of this session. So I'd like to begin by thanking several colleagues. I'd like to thank Liliana Milkova, Malene Theodore, Jake Gagne, Liz Harnett, and Stacy, who's doing the live captions for this program. I'd also like to thank all of my colleagues who care so deeply about the Wordle Study Center, about what it is, and also what it can become. And it is my utmost pleasure to now introduce my guest of honor and our guest of honor, Fred Wilson, who really does not need an introduction, but I will still take the liberty to. Fred Wilson is an artist whose work holds up a mirror up to museum institutions and invites museums to face themselves. Since his 1992 landmark exhibition at the Maryland Historical Society titled Mining the Museum, Wilson has worked across museum storage and display to excavate and transform museum strategies of collection and display. Wilson has represented the United States at the 2003 Venice Biennale. He is the recipient of the MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant and the Larry Aldrich Foundation Award. Wilson's work and writing has been very influential on how I think of my work as in the museum and also as the manager of the Wordle Study Center. And so it is my utmost privilege to welcome Fred Wilson. Hello, Fred. How are you today?
I am very good. Thank you.
Excellent. Could you tell us a little bit about where you're tuning in from?
I'm tuning in from my loft in Manhattan. Actually, my spouse, Whitfield Lavelle's studio. My studio's in Brooklyn, and with the pandemic, I go there gingerly. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I do love the prominently placed globe
Oh,
in the background.
yes, my globe.
So I wanted to open up with a question, and I'm bringing in two images that you have shared with me from your experience of working with museum storage. And so I'd love for you to reflect on why is museum storage important to you, and perhaps even how did you get interested in museum storage?
Well, having the long story is, and I won't be long, is that when I was in college, I worked in the school's museum, the Newburgh Museum in New York, and I was a guard, and so I was a guard during the day, and sometimes overnight, and so being there at night, the guard station's usually, well, this one was in the basement with all the things that the museum owns, but very you know, haphazardly arranged. And so I was always conscious of the juxtaposition between how storage is there and then in the galleries themselves, they tell a different story. And that just stayed in my head for years. And eventually when I started working at various museums, considering specifically the Metropolitan and the Museum of Natural History in their education departments, I became really aware of the difference between the two different spaces, and also how those spaces informed me about how manipulated the gallery spaces are on the public, as because the storage rooms are, as I said, as I like to say, it's sort of the unconscious of the museum, and things are placed not for view by anybody else but the but conservators and registrars and curators when they're looking at for specific things. Whereas the galleries, it's highly controlled and for the view for what the curator thinks is important to be understood about the things on view. And so I really enjoyed seeing the things in storage, uh, which tell a different story than things on view.
And could you speak a little bit about these two images that you shared with me? Maybe about what is it like to encounter a bust that is peeking out through layers of wrapping? And what is it like to encounter a sculpture that is directly next to another work of art?
Not next to, in front of.
In front of, exactly.
um, well, I really enjoy storage because I learn a lot about the artworks by how they're juxtaposed. And so from that, I really gain a lot of insight beyond what the institution wants you to think about the object. The wrap figure, which you always see, this one is just usually, it was just kind of not seriously wrapped, just draped over it. But whoever the gentleman is behind it, kind of looks through at you just the same, but also has a ghostly appearance. And I'm familiar with all these kind of things, but every once in a while, something captivates me as beyond what it's supposed to be, and that was one of them. The other is this sculpture, 20th early 20th century sculpture, against a Elizabeth Murray painting, and I thought the exuberance of his gesture and the exuberance of her painting was a wonderful combination. And of course, the color of the figure of the rock and the aluminum grating behind Elizabeth Murray's painting, I thought it was quite a wonderful ensemble. And sometimes I even put things that I see as they are in storage out on view to hopefully reveal these other lives of the objects and other meanings that they can possibly have besides what the curator has created for you.
And these two images are also from the collection of the Allen Memorial Museum, right?
Yes,
From
at
Oberlin.
Oberlin. Yes.
And so it sounds to me that part of your process of working with museum storage is time, is the time of the visit, is repeated visit, is also the act of browsing. Could you speak a little bit about the practice of visiting museum storage and spending time with museum storage?
The longer I have in to work on a project, the more juice I can squeeze out of it, because in order to do any of these projects, I have a notebook that when I write down, general conversations with people within storage and outside of storage, but and things that I see when I first arrive that after repeated visits I may not see anymore. So I try to um, capture those thoughts, and whether they end up in the exhibition or not, they end up in another exhibition later on. They say something. The process of looking and reading and looking at the objects in situ, and then when I finally do decide if I want them in the galleries, sometimes aspects of what I've saw in storage, what I've seen in storage, or what I've thought about the object, or the combination of objects ends up in the exhibition, which no one would realize where that thought came from. Um, and because storage, the reason for storage is quite different than the reason for an exhibition. Um, it allows me to kind of think about these objects as objects, not necessarily as as either great works of art or something that maybe is less than a great work of art, but see them as objects in the world rather than all the trappings that the art world lays over them, and artists are perhaps thinking about them, but they have a different life when they've left the artist, and sometimes it's painful to see, and sometimes it's quite exhilarating to see that the object has a life other than um, uh, the curator or even the artists themselves have thought of for that object. So I do enjoy the freedom that these objects have within the confines of storage.
So today I'm going to ask you to do something that's a little unusual for you. I wanted to highlight that usually your process involves um, a longer period of time working with an institution, definitely speaking with so many of the people who work there across departments, and again, spending a lot of time. And so today I am going to introduce you to the Wordle Study Center. And Fred, I know that you haven't had a chance to actually physically visit it yourself, but that's definitely the case with many people on this call. And so I will introduce the Wordle Study Center, and then we will talk a little bit about how is the Wordle Study Center similar to storage? How is it different? And so I will present for just a short bit. And so here is the first image of the Margaret and Angus Wordle Study Center. This is the Yale University Art Gallery's Open Study Storage Center. Imagine yourself standing in a space that is about as large as a football field
Oh.
and that holds about 42,000 objects.
Mm.
And so, as a point of comparison, the gallery downtown probably has around 12,000 objects on display, and this space holds 42,000 objects. Each and every one of these objects we could have multiple programs on because they all hold so many stories. Today we'll be really thinking about the design and really the function of the Wordle Study Center. You'll notice that there are these glass cases, and indeed the glass cases are seen throughout. It is an open design plan for added flexibility, and the objects are arranged by medium. So ceramics are with ceramics, glass is with glass, metals is with metals. The lighting that you see in this image is quite dramatic. This is not usually the kind of lighting that we work in. We might turn it on for a tour or a public program.
Oh.
But really, every day, the space has very bright lights. It is a space of work. Here, we're just looking at the other side of those glass cases that we just saw. So if you look at the far left side, that's actually the case that we were looking at from the other side. And now we have walked on the other side of the case, and you see that there is ample space and opportunity to move the objects around, rearrange them, whether it's by the curators who are doing processing of their own collection, maybe planning an exhibition or planning a reinstallation. This space is very much used by researchers and also by students. So those tables that you see here definitely function as seminar tables. The objects that you see in the foreground are from the Indo-Pacific collection. And so these cabinets where we sometimes store objects also function as a space for object arrangement. You'll see in the far part of this image that there are compact storage cases as well. So I just want to highlight that, yes, we do have these glass cases, but if you look all the way back here, we do have this compact shelving as well.
Mm.
And you might see a detail of this little handle that you can actually move the compact shelving.
Mm-hmm.
This space, in addition to the open plan space, we also have ample classrooms. And so the image on the right is an example of one of our object study classrooms. We have 3 of these. And so for these, a class will come in, and then the objects that are relevant to the class will be brought into the classroom. Then we also have special collections classrooms, and we have one of the examples of these special collections on the left, and this is the Alan Chasnoff room. And the late Alan Chazanoff was a maker, collector. And in this room, you see a lot of stuff, right? You see artworks. There's also a collection of novelty ties, because part of Chazanoff's project was that everyone can be a collector. And so it's a kind of collection within a collection. So I wanted to just highlight all of the many different functions that the Wordle Study Center has before returning back to asking you, Fred, if you can help us think of how would you place the Wordle Study Center in relationship to storage and in relationship to display? Here, I'll just also say that I'm bringing in two images. The upper left is from our deep storage facility at the gallery, which we are actively moving out of because we now have spaces like the Wordle Study Center. The It's kind of hard to see, but you can see these tablets that are resting on styrofoam. And then on the bottom left, we have an installation view of James Prosek's Art Artifice Artifact, which is an exhibit that is currently up, though of course the gallery is closed at the moment. So Fred, how would you situate the Wordle Study Center in regards to storage and display?
Well, display itself is a very mediated environment and very thought out, because for the there's an audience beyond the person who decided what they're showing, and with a certain amount of thought process going into how people will receive it and what is juxtaposed to what to a degree. Um, it's a very conscious space, uh, and particularly about the visual, because that is the main mode for art museums, at least, of importance, and making these connections between images and objects and ideas. Um, However, storage has a whole other reason for being. It's uh, it's generally not a space where the registrar, conservator, or curator is thinking about um, viewing anybody else viewing this storage space as a way to make meaning. It's basically there for their use, and it's organized uh, for their use in to study, to um, kind of just basically put it somewhere where it's safe and accessible to the conservators and registrars and curators. However, so it's pretty much unconsciously arranged, and that's kind of why I like to go there, because it's not something that is directly about the visual, but of course the visual is always active if you're looking for that, and they're not looking for that when they place these in storage. However, your space is in a way a combination of both. I mean, even uh, different from open storage, which is also in the museum, which is also highly um, um, the curators are aware that it's going to be viewed. So there is a bit of that kind of concern. But your space is really about study, and being able to, for those who come, can kind of understand something about each object, however, realizing that it's not organized by the usual galleries organization in museums. It's by material. Um, so I like to think of this as kind of like, if the storage is the unconscious, and the gallery is the conscious mind, this is kind of like the waking dream, that your center is sort of like in between those two states. There's a certain amount of um, realness to it and importance to the way it's displayed, however, and can be readily viewed. However, there's the it's problematized by the fact that the objects are not stored in any way related to the use or meaning of the objects on view. And that can get to be a thorny issue with some indigenous groups. Certainly, um, it's not here in this environment, but sometimes things that are owned by different people may have very specific ideas about who should see them, who shouldn't see them, and how they should be displayed, and when they should be viewed, and all that kind of thing. This, however, is a kind of a leveling of all that, um, and um, and so in that case, it's for me, it's sort of um, it has the combination of both aspects of display and storage. Uh, However, storage, many things are hidden, but this is very consciously about seeing as well. It's just very obviously not the same, organized the same way a gallery exhibition would be made, with bringing a particular idea or thought in mind. It's all about size, scale, material, and those who come either get attracted to certain things or more than likely learn about particular things that the professor wants you to know, but also it enables the curator to uh, to understand these works relative to the other cultures in that material, working in that material. So, yeah, I'd be curious to sort of see what it feels like to be there. Like you're saying, at first you're struck by all the glass and the bright lights and all these objects displayed, you know, in the same way. But I am, that probably falls away when you start focusing in on the individual objects that you're there to see, which is what happens with all these three spaces. You get comfortable in those particular spaces, and then you stop seeing it as an otherworldly space. Certainly, galleries are no longer otherworldly for anyone unless you're first going to them. Storage remains so, I think, until it just you lose that feeling of wonder, what's going to be around the corner in a storage space if you're there a lot. And this one, probably similarly, one can get used to this environment, even though it's um, feels clinical and sort of scientifically arranged, whether they are or not. It's just kind of the nature of the design materials that are used in this particular arrangement.
Fred, your point about the glass, I think dovetails really nicely to my next question, just because certainly many visitors remark on the glass and the glass cases when they first enter the Wordle Study Center. There is a kind of sublime experience under specific lighting. The whole entire center might have this kind of bluish, greenish, glassy, cool tone. But the more time that you spend with the objects, exactly as you mentioned, the glass just completely fades into the background and the focus is on the object. And so glass as the dominant material signature of the Wordle Study Center, its main goal is to be looked through, is to, in some ways, to become forgotten about. It is a function of transparency and accessibility. And you have worked with glass in such a fascinating and different way than the way that glass oftentimes appears as a material of display. And so I'd love for you to maybe reflect on your use of glass. And here I'm bringing in an installation view of, to continue with the Oberlin theme, this is an installation you did called Black to the Powers of 10 from the year 20, it was up from 2016 until 2017. And here I'm particularly struck by this black glass vitrine that is opaque. We cannot necessarily look into its contents. And then also these black so-called drips, which people have described as tears. They are abstract, that are all over the wall. So, could you comment on working with glass and specifically about working with glass in a way that highlights opacity and blackness?
Well, I have to say, because you didn't see the exhibition in person, the glass case, um, from this vantage point, you can't see anything in it. But as you get up to it, you do see through it and see what's inside. And there's two of them, and so they have different things inside uh, that reveal itself only as you get up to it. And I kind of enjoyed that process of discovery, even with that black glass case. Um, and one of them, well, I can just tell you, one of them has a skeleton in it, and the other has ink wells in it. And there are reasons for that, but I did like slowing down the process of seeing, whereas the study center um, kind of immediately says says openness, says this is who we are, this is what we have. These cases don't. It's a slower process, and or a surprise, and so when you get to it, you have to maybe rethink of what it was that you were thinking about this object as being, or you know what's inside it, as decide what it's about. Um, Similarly, with the what was is right behind it, the mirror, combination of black glass mirrors, it seems extremely flat, and it is, and it's dense black uh, glass. However, when you get up to it, you do see things in the room, and you can see yourself, and not as you would in your center, but it does reveal other things as you get to it. And I'm interested in all the meanings of the color black, and the drips are again uh, uh, have a lot to do with that. Those were the first forms I made in glass at uh, in Pilchuck with I learned how to blow glass, but I worked with one of the most famous glass blowers in the country, Dante Marioni, and so after I don't work with him anymore, although he and I love working together when we have the opportunity. But these I felt that the color black has so many meanings. In fact, I think the color black has many diverse meanings, more than any other color. Uh, and um, and the drip form is for me a way to access a variety of modes and moods and meanings, um, that the color black only emphasizes. They could be, as you said, tears. People have said that they were, um, you know, like rain, or even, well, I had a French art dealer said, "Well, I love the black sperm," which wasn't exactly what I had in mind. But anyway, you can see it in any which way you want to see it. And for me, it's the arrangement, the combination, the juxtaposition of the objects that either says weather or sadness or what have you. And so the combination of black having multiple meanings, and this form having multiple meanings, and then how they're arranged and juxtaposed within themselves, uh, amplifies the variety of meaning. And so, um, in my practice as working with museum collections, there's often a great deal of information that I'm putting out there when I do these projects in museums. Not this is my works in a space, but in a museum project, there's multiple meanings that I am infusing in the exhibition, so that you, like other institutions, I'm sort of bombarding with the visual, but also meaning that you have to kind of you can put together in certain ways for yourself, uh, by the combination of things. But here, this is the way, using the color black and the drip form, it frees me personally from um, the history of a particular object, the uh, specific storylines that one knows about a particular object, and allows the viewer to, like most artists when they're working, allows the viewer to kind of come up with their own connection to the image and the object. And so it's kind of a nice balance for me between the museum projects and then the works I make in my studio or have fabricated.
This point about forming connections, I think it's so important because it also brushes upon the question of value, as in what is the value system of the museum, what is the value of display, and also how does an individual make meaning or make connections and make value from some kind of a juxtaposition or an arrangement of objects. And I'd love to ask you to reflect on how you navigate, whether it's individual values or value systems, and really thinking about how the museum as an abstract entity, of course, embodies, reflects, and enforces value systems, one of them being white supremacy.
Mm.
And then at the same time, the second that we encounter two objects next to one another, we start to evaluate, right? We start to compare and contrast and notice differences and similarities. And for this question, maybe I can ask you to reflect on another installation that you did at Oberlin at the Allen. And this is Wildfire Test Pit, which was up exactly at the same time as the previous installation, where you really delved into juxtaposition from objects across the collection. So how do you navigate value in your work?
Uh, well, when I'm doing a project such as this, I do have something in mind, and choose the choosing of objects have particular meaning for me, but also in relationship to the other objects. This project was really had a narrative to it. It was called Wildfire Test Pit, which was Wildfire was the native name of Ammonia Lewis, who was African American, Native American woman, who a sculptor, and she went to Oberlin for a brief period. And so from that, I got very inspired to create this installation, which, as in the research that I did um, her about her life and her work, this installation came out of using the material that I could find in Oberlin and locally um, in Ohio. Um, and so the notion of these are all plaster casts, so they're not something that you'd find in your center, but maybe someday in like you know I don't know, several hundred years, these things will become these objects would become themselves something to be studied about and to learn about these the 19th and 20th century that found these objects important for what reasons. Um, of course, here in the center is an African uh, uh, Baga Nimba figure, uh, so that's made of wood, and clearly the use of the difference between materials became important as well, the juxtaposition of these materials. And um, value, for an artist is different for than other people. Um, for me, if they were made of bronze or they were made of marble, might not make a bit of difference to me, you know, uh, in certain ways, in the ways that a curator might deem it, think about it. However, of course, I'm interested in the plaster cast because it is a reproduction of something that may not be in the United States, and it's there as a stand-in for the real thing uh, somewhere else, and you sort of gain something from those objects because of the relationship to the original object. However, the aesthetic quality of those objects certainly is compromised by the process of reproduction and not the original material that the artist used. So they they have meaning, but the meaning is shifts slightly, and it's all in your mind when you're in a gallery, of plaster casts or what have you, that you lull yourself into thinking that not that this is the real object, but the value is still important, um, in as something that you can kind of gain some knowledge from, and that now we don't have that sort of thing anymore. Plaster casts of I don't know whose sculpture, uh, of contemporary times, because we don't have that same relationship with the ancients, and but so using them is kind of looking back at all our relations and uh, with these objects, and those histories, connected histories that became the dominant narrative for Americans who didn't never got to Europe and saw the originals, but made this connection between Europe and the and themselves, as seeing themselves, those that could see themselves in these objects, um, and as if it's their lineage, when for most of Americans they're not particularly their lineage. But it again, it was um, kind of used as uh, a created way to understand one's heritage, even though it's definitely not connected. And for those of us who could not connect ourselves to that particular heritage, I found it extremely satisfying, because this collection had objects from Africa, Native American objects, that I could weave together these iconic images to create a narrative that related to Edmonia Lewis, who lived in a very difficult time when she was, when she was young, and eventually left the United States for Italy to create her sculptures among a group of women sculptors in the 19th century and early 20th. So um, to me, this project, which you're only seeing a teeny tiny bit of, uh, is about all those things, and the material aspect of it is quite important. Besides the juxtapositions and relationships, the material uh, says a great deal about the objects and the meanings, and if you juxtapose this image to your center, it's obvious that there's a different that there's that you're not able to make those other kinds of relationships or differences, because everything's of the same material. So within the cases, so it kind of I mean, there's a lot to unpack with that, because many people made things with materials that were available or had particular significance to use those particular materials. Um, and so the differences between them, even though they were all the same material, could be vast, and the importance to one's culture is impossible to kind of really know just by looking, because they all are of the same material, and not necessarily are the cultures that everybody knows.
Thank you so much for all of this. This is the first time that I've kind of noticed how much tactility is important in your work. Of course, the visual strategy of display and thinking about bringing in the visual, but um, that when you talk about juxtaposition, it's not just about contrast, but it's also getting into the root of the word, as in putting things into proximity, and the act of actually physically moving them and placing them in
Mm-hmm.
space. And so, just returning back to the Wordle Study Center, I mean, it's true. The decision was made that the objects would be arranged a certain way, and there was the question of, well, should they be arranged by scale? Should, for instance, they go from the smallest object to the largest object,
Mm.
or maybe arranged by color? And so,
Oh, color.
or color, which would be really fascinating.
Yeah,
So we landed on medium because of the added function of conservation.
right.
So with metals being with metals, they're in these microclimates where the humidity is kept low. And of course, we can turn the lights off on, for instance, headdresses with feathers.
Hmm.
But of course, it, the only way to really create those juxtapositions is potentially by taking the objects out of the case, right, and moving them into the classroom or that table
Yes,
or
yes.
this. And so I'd love to pick your brain a little bit about the location of the Wordle Study Center. So the
Mm.
center is located at a distance from the gallery. So the downtown gallery, you can take a shuttle or you can drive about 14 minutes to get to Yale West Campus, and the Wordle Study Center is located there. So you have spoken so much about this perspectival shift that happens when you experience that juxtaposition between what's on display in the gallery and then pivoting and seeing open storage maybe still in the building.
Mhm,
But what happens when this center, this waking dream,
mhm.
becomes a destination in and of itself? Will we have to keep coming up with strategies to inspire visitors to think anew?
Uh, for new visitors, no, but for others who are repeat visitors and are not there for a particular class, uh, there may be, there will be a reason to kind of think about how within the structure of your center there, um, different things can be um, highlighted, or different ways of looking at them can be um, considered uh, within the um, the way you arrange these things. And I can come up with a million different ways of doing that without even touching the objects. But I think the most important aspect of that is to not necessarily to move objects around, which is certainly an important thing, could be an important thing to do, but ways to make people think about the objects differently than is currently the way they think about these objects, and their where they are and how they are. Um, and you know, uh, that's the center is new, so um, perhaps it's still in this glowing phase of just taking all this in. But eventually, there'll definitely be kind of something important about being able to reflect and understand these objects for the variety that they are, and problematize them as well for the public, so they don't just take as God's truth uh, how these things are on display.
Thank you. And I'd love to incorporate a question from John Ago, who is the Wordle Study Center student assistant and who has done a lot of research on your work. And he asked, so much of your work has involved unveiling and contesting oppressive logics of museum display and storage. What would a egalitarian museum look like, if that's
Ooh.
what we want? And what would need to change for museums to become more just institutions?
Oh boy,
It's a big question,
that's a
but
big
that will lead us
question,
to the
and
Q&A.
and also thorny,
Mm-hmm.
because you know how things come into collections, when they came in, and why. Uh, you Once you open that up, you can really begin to see these objects in a very different light. Um, and I mean, there are many different ways to view these objects, and think about them. Um, and you know, from my perspective, you understand things. The more you know about particular objects, the more you have questions you have. And Especially with what's going on in Europe with European museums and African countries. Um, and these questions will come up, and these are questions that perhaps it's good to start now to kind of ask oneself for the institution to ask oneself about those particular questions, which will ultimately lead, jump from Europe to the United States if they haven't already. But uh, there, yeah, to me, there's so many ways uh, to begin for the museum, the notion of museum to move into the 21st century. It hasn't, and even a new beautiful space um, uh, is one way to kind of reveal things about collections, but on a deep philosophical basis, looking at the history of museums and how this institution uh, fits into it. Um, it should be a center of exchange and discussion around difficult issues, and many institutions have really uh, had to take it on, uh, and um and you know it really is not only object display, but conversations uh, by those whose collections uh, they originated. These in this particular image are do not seem to be ones that would have that kind of conversation. However, um, uh, it does behoove the institution to be very forthright in the discussion of the artist's intent in relation to how they're displayed, the collector's intent, and the time in history when they were the intent of history at the moment that they were collected. And besides the transparency of the glass, transparency of history and meaning, and the thorny histories of ignorance, uh, that and power uh, will always be there, and it's best to get ahead of that and be in the front side of it, dealing with it before it comes knocking on your door and you're not prepared.
Absolutely. And just speaking of conversations and voices, I'd love to incorporate more voices into this discussion. So there is a question, there are actually quite a few questions from the audience. And so I'll try to do my best to um, group them around theme. There is one group of questions around your installation practice and seeing the effects of that. So to what extent do the installations actually lead to institutional change? And
Ah,
the exact question is, within practice, are there instances when a concept juxtaposition observed in one institution storage space is applied later to a different institution gallery display? Or is your process location institutional specific? And what happens after the installation?
well, there are various layers. Certain things can be, people do transfer particular ideas to other institutions. And I have had friends who have worked on these projects with me or in different locations say they see something of my influence in another institution. And usually when I work on something, they influence the people who I work with. And since museums change, personnel changes all the time, they take bits of it to wherever the new institutions that they're going to. And so you do see some aspect of what I was thinking, and of people who I worked with, or people who have seen other projects. And they do, that is, so for me, these projects are also artworks. So they're not meant to be didactic. They're meant for people to take what they can from them and take it away with them, and then see museums in a different way, or if they're in professional, see what their practice, see what they do in a different way, and hopefully that informs the next thing they do, or perhaps for the visitor, it informs the questions that they ask of our other institutions. And so to varying degrees, there have been, shifts, subtle shifts at some institutions, and at least the conversation is raised a little higher. Or, once you do something that is kind of, has a certain effect or a profound effect, you can't put the genie back in the bottle, and so the conversation has to continue. And so there's a I don't expect to change the world. Really, it's sort of about changing individuals. When you're in a museum, you're looking at an artwork, and you have this relationship with artwork, and I'm just trying to uh, make one think and then see the rest of the world in a slightly different way that perhaps raises the conversation, and can shift practice in a very subtle way, because I'm only one person. But uh, yeah, I think there have been situations where there's been demonstrative change in other places, and the institution itself, because often the public says to the institution, and particularly with in Baltimore, that was the most shocking project for, since it was the first one, and for Baltimore. Um, what the public asked the institution, what are you going to do next? And then the staff internally asks, but then when the public asks, there does have to be some kind of change or shift. I'm not saying that they became the museum of my dreams, but the, but hopefully that project had its effect on other institutions and conversations about what institutions can do, and what they are, and what are they saying that they don't know they're saying to the public. Um,
Thank you, Fred. There's a group of questions that's coming in specifically asking about you and how
oh,
you are and how you are adjusting to this year. So, for
mm,
instance, Diane Moses asks, has COVID affected your practice? What are you currently working on? What
no,
advice can you provide upcoming artist curators who are working to uncover hidden narratives within institutions?
no, my, that's a lot. I'm not working any museum projects at the moment. I probably get off the Zoom, then I'll remember. Oh, what about that? No, but in fact, it has affected my practice. Certainly, making glass things in Venice. Well, they're all on lockdown now, so nothing's being made. I continue to sort of come up with ideas, but I can't go to Italy. I can't send imagery to my glass people in Italy, so that's sort of on hold. One is always creative, thinking of new things to do, so that's not a problem. And I'm not flying. I'm not traveling anywhere, so it's all very much in my studio, working on um, commissions that I've been working on for a while, and thinking about the future of what I want to do beyond this this pandemic. Um, and you know, you just sort of like everybody, you live your life, and um, COVID has affected my ability to make work. As I said originally, I think I said that my studio is, I'm not in my studio. I'm this my home, and my spouse's studio I'm sitting in. Mine is we're in Manhattan, and my studio's in Brooklyn. So I do not get on subways right now. So I'm uh, taking car services and going back and forth and trying to, and I haven't been to the studio for months and months because it's not huge, and I have a couple of people working with me, so we shift days when we go in. But so we're making a go of it. But it's a time. Luckily for artists, you can always think about things, and you can always have little drawings about future projects and things you might want to do, and also reflect on the time. And but usually my works never really directly, um, there's not a one-to-one change or thing in the work from a particular, I've noticed a particular event. Like when 9/11 happened, my work didn't shift drastically. There were a couple of pieces that I did do that related to 9/11, which, but several years later. And so I expect that to happen with this. It's just, for me, it sort of has, thoughts and feelings have to wash over me and come out in a very natural way. I don't respond to things directly like that. There has to be some kind of deeper uh, meaning and deeper feeling that has affected me so much that it comes out. Um, and so that's what I would say to an artist. This is a time of doing what you can do, and just be aware of how you're reacting and responding to the world, and that is different from before, and will probably be different, fade, years later. But at least when you see that something you're doing in the future, acknowledge the fact that it has something to do with this past, as I very positively think, this past pandemic, this past trauma, whichever trauma you of this time period you find compelling.
Fred, your observation about awareness, practice of awareness, and then also taking time to metabolize does speak to a whole slew of questions that we're getting about the unconscious and this idea of the waking dream. And maybe my colleague, the curator of modern contemporary art, Keely Orgeman, asked a question about what happens as you become aware of the process of whether it's thinking or looking, or this process of moving through the waking dream?
Hmm.
How does that impact art viewing?
Uh, if you could just say that again, because my mind kind of jumped over that. It was sailing someplace else. So just say that again for me. That happens.
Oh, no problem. I can actually pull up the question.
Oh.
Uh, so Keely Orgeman says, I love the idea of viewing the Wordle Study Center as a waking dream. In a related way, as you, Fred Wilson, spend more and more time in storage space, how does your increased consciousness about what you are seeing inform your process of making meaning? For example, what happens when with your thought process, when you discover the identities of the artists who made these objects?
Uh, I guess, you know, um, and I would imagine she's talking about the general identities, the backgrounds, the kind of environment or cultures that they came from, rather than the individual. Like, oh, I know that person. Um, I, whatever, basically when I'm in storage, well, I'm in the world. I'm like a sponge, and it all, I just take it all in, and then some things stick, some things remain. And basically, maybe I didn't mention, but I doing these projects, I have a notebook, and the notebook for a particular project, and I just write down, you know, ideas that I have, but mostly just observations uh, that I see, small things, or something that somebody might say that somehow is interesting to me, and I write them all down. And over a period of time, the sort of research period of time, and some seem to make sense to me after this period of kind of research on all levels, emotional, historical, intellectual, and just some candid cavalier comments. I relook at what and my ideas along the way, and I relook at all this stuff that I would have forgotten if I hadn't written it down during that time period. And sometimes things fall away because I've gotten used to the place and kind of understand that certain ideas are not that interesting because of the environment in the place. My first initial thought was basically just not that interesting. It was just something I didn't know, and then but others remain because they seem to be germane. They seem to come back in my thought thinking, and they don't seem to become um, just a frivolous thought. And so I weave together all these things that seem to still mean something, and something I've never thought of, or no one else seems to be thinking, and it still is fresh for me. And that's what I start with to weave together the project. Uh, so I just basically a sponge for a month or two, depending on how long I have there, and then review what I've, review and see what still is important.
Excellent. I'd love to get to two more questions if
Mhm.
possible. So Shelby Graham says, thank you, Fred from UC Santa Cruz.
Yeah. Hey.
Fabulous comment about the responsibility of institutions to be forthright in stating artists' intention and to reveal the thorny history of power, racism, and capitalism. How can institutions do this other than labels?
Well, of course, I would say in how they arrange things, uh, arrange their objects, be heighten. They should heighten their awareness of how they're displaying things, uh, one to another, within a gallery, gallery to gallery, in the entire environment, how that is impacting how you think about particular culture and other cultures, um, and um, and do that on a personal level, but do that as a group as well, to sort of see if uh, others have noticed what you're noticing, or if the things that each one of you are thinking or noticing is something that's germane or not thought about enough. Um, so I think that is a way. Also, I mean, I, you know, not to kind of say the obvious, but diversifying one's staff, uh, in all ways uh, possible, is a way to learn as well about the what you might not be seeing for either for no other reason than that's just not your worldview. And it's important to sort of take other people's voices seriously, and institutions need to, as they are beginning to now. Hopefully, it's a long term and not just because the heat is on. Uh, um, take into the body of the institution those who have very diverse perspectives on the institution, on culture, on um, you know the world, and all if it's all in goodwill and in conversation and openness, uh, and this is top to bottom, not just staff, but trustees, which um, you know do not directly affect, if it's a good museum, directly affect the programming, uh, but in governance, it's amazing how particular initiatives become important when there are those people at the top who have some idea or knowledge about the reasons that change is necessary. But that is also beginning to happen. I just hope that it's not. I mean, we've been through these just at a meeting the other day, and there are those of us who have been around long enough to know that this is not the first time that these issues have been brought up. It's a cyclical. There's the heat turns on, and then everybody's like, "Oh my goodness, what am I going to do?" And there's lots of flurry of conversation, and then in the heat's off, they go sort of some of these important subjects get lost within the day to day. And I'm hoping that this time it's not going to be that, and it's up to those of us in institutions to make sure it's not that, make sure that it doesn't go away. And so, yeah, that's how I feel about that.
Thank you, Fred. And I think you've given us so much to both metabolize and process and also action items. And we are actually over time, so I
Oh,
want to honor everybody's time. There are certainly a lot of questions in the chat box. I can save them and share them with you, Fred, after
great,
the
great,
event so
great,
you
great.
can follow along. And for everyone on this call, if you'd like to one day experience the waking dream of the Wordle Study Center, please follow along. We hope to reopen. We look forward to opening and hosting you very soon when it's safe. Please contact me for resources, digital resources for teaching and learning. And Fred, thank you so much for taking this time
My
to meet
pleasure.
with us and to speak with us.
And I can't wait to come and see the center myself
Anytime.
and give you my 2 cents.
I can't wait. All right, Fred, thanks so much. And thank you
Thank
to
you.
everyone.
Thank you.